To everybody, and those who came at 9 o'clock, special welcome. Those who came at 9:10, next week at 9, and the people who aren't here yet, next week at 9. It's very important that we start together. It's not because we're Yekkers. Probably aren't too many. Anybody here a Yekker? No. So that's not the problem. But the problem is that we're a learning group. What we want to do during the entire year is to learn together. And if you come in the middle, so you miss what maybe I've said, what somebody else has heard, what else one of your colleagues have said. So it's awfully important to try to come on time. And we will start at 9 every week. Now, let me introduce the camera. This is the camera, this is Faggy, who is responsible for the camera. The reason that there's a camera is that we're taking all of the lectures from this course and putting them up on our website. You'll get an email when the website's finally up. It's not up yet, but there'll be a website for this course, and in the website, all of the lectures will be there. That's not a reason to come late. But in case you can't make it at all, you can always see the lecture part of the course, and more or less we would expect that you would do that. The rest about the website, I'll explain to you next week when we have the website. It's not functional right now. That's technicalities. My name is Alan Flashman, and I am very grateful for the partnership that we're starting now. This is a new experiment. This is the first time that Neve, or as far as I know anyone, has tried to put up a formal training program in family therapy for the Dati and Haredi communities. That it's comfortable to learn, it's comfortable to do the treatment, and it's comfortable to think, not necessarily like family therapy. Family therapy was started in San Francisco and New York. Har Nof is pretty different than San Francisco and New York. And what we want to do is to talk about the families that you come from and the families that you'll be treating, which are different families from the families that were treated when family therapy was started. So what we're going to do is in some ways take apart the pieces of the puzzle, learn how family therapy was constructed in other cultures, and to work together in figuring out how to make family therapy coherent with your culture. That's the idea. And that's a new experiment. And when you start a new experiment and you have wonderful partners, the first thing you do is to say thank you. This is a partnership. We're going to try to learn together. Now, while we're saying thank you, there's a few other thank yous that we want to say. First of all, immediately to Naama and to Sarah and to Dina, who were so helpful in getting us set up. This is a new room. It's a whole new project. And the fact that you have the reader on time in front of you, people spend a lot of time and effort working on that, so we want to thank them. And before we start, we certainly want to thank the person who's responsible for making this at all possible. It's a step from his work, but we always want to remember to thank Dr. Levitz for creating the platform that we're basically not just standing on, we're trying to take another step from there. But this wouldn't be possible without an awful lot of years of intensive and loving effort on his part. One last technicality, it's actually not a technicality. When you do treatment in the clinic, it's very important to remember that the person who comes after you isn't your cleaning person. In other words, when you get a room, take a look at the room, and when you finish, it takes about a minute or two, put the room back to exactly how it was. That includes the last session at night, because in the morning we make a quick run through and make sure that all the rooms are set up, but there's no intermediary between you at night and the person who's going to use the room in the morning. It's you. So please do us a favor and remember to leave the room so that the next person in the morning has a room that's the same as you found it. That's pretty easy, right? Now the hard part starts. My course is going to run all year long, and it's a theoretical course. We're going to think. This is not a technical course about what to do when you're with a family. That you'll be learning over the space of time. But we want you to be able to think through what you're doing, why you're doing, because as you know, even if you have the greatest supervisor in the world, supervisor's not with you when you're in the room. And the things that a therapist has to do is to feel, but also to be able to reflect and understand, if I'm lost, what might it be? Because when you're dealing with families, you'll find that you're lost. That's the initial experience of everybody who sits with more than one person. That there's something going on between them, and I'm not sure what it is, and I'm feeling a little crazy. So what we want to be able to do in the space of this course is to, when you start to feel a little, good morning, when you start to feel a little crazy in the room, we want you to be able to say, wait a minute, I could think about something or other. There's something that could help me to understand and to think my way through it, and that's going to take a year. Now, the other thing is that we're going to go slowly, but I really want you to read, because, put it this way, I think you probably know from your experiences in education, what I say, what you hear in the room, is one part of the learning. It's not the whole of the learning. You need to be by yourself, reading, thinking through things, thinking how what you're reading is different than what you're learning in the classroom, because we want to hear a lot of different voices here. There are a lot of different voices about family learning. So that's why you have a reader. And there are basically 7 units in the reader, and there's reading for each class. The reading for this class, obviously you didn't get it in time, and the truth is, I know that no one's going to read it. I'm realistic. It's a problem with how it was copied, and it's a problem with how it's written. I'll explain it to you. If you skip the first reading, that's okay. You want to go for it? It's a wonderful article. You might find yourselves reading it better at the very end of the course. But the second article in the reader, I want you to read for next week, because I want us to be able to discuss it. It's going to be basically a case, and it's important that that case, you understand what's in it so that we can talk about it. Now, there is also a syllabus for the course, and I don't think that they don't have the syllabus, right? No, that's the reader. So by next class, we'll hand you the syllabus. The syllabus is the readings that are in the reader that are required, plus all sorts of things that in your spare time you may want to read about, because we're going to mention a lot of things that are not just in the reader. So the reader is the bare bones of the course, and the rest, if you want references, they'll be in the syllabus. One last thing that you'll find in the syllabus, it comes up not next class, but the class after it, is one case that we're all going to be reading this year. That will be our case for the year. It's in a book called The Family Crucible. In the syllabus, you'll see it. Has anybody ever heard of The Family Crucible? Oh, there we go. You mean you've read it?
Yeah.
You don't know it by heart yet? Okay. But the Bryce family? Yeah, so it's a whole book about the Bryce family. It's a very original book because it comes at the very beginning of family therapy, and it was a case that was done by the 2 therapists in family therapy with the largest hearts. There were some people in family therapy that the balance between brain and heart was not exactly what we would wish for ourselves. The people with the biggest hearts were Whitaker, and he had a junior partner who later became a famous family therapist, and they wrote a book called The Family Crucible. You'll see the reference when you get the syllabus, but for each lesson or each unit, there's a section that I want you to read of the Bryce family, so we can talk about them as a case that, as if we're treating them, and you'll get to know them. But what I don't suggest you do is to read it that way. In other words, it's a great. Anybody? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah.
It's a good. Oh, there we go. It's not just me. Okay. It's a good book, right?
Great book.
None of the theory that's in that book is in this course. That's the other voice. And that's why I want you to be able to hear a different way of looking at things, a different way of doing things, and then we'll discuss the differences. But the case is fully alive because it happened at the time that people were just beginning to do family therapy. So find it, used, if somebody wants to read it in Hebrew, it's in Hebrew, it's in a lot of languages, but start to read it. That's part of what we'll do over the course of this semester. So, we're going to start. And we're actually going to start with, well, let's see how this works. There we go. You prefer to see this with the lights off? That's better? Yeah. Everybody can see? I'm asking you guys, yeah. You can see, okay? All right. So, this, you just have to move your name away from the screen so I can see it. There you go. Thanks. This is the first family therapy case, and it was conducted very poorly by a Jewish physician named Sigmund Freud. And the case was conducted in 1906 and published in 1908. Now, I'll mention a few people here and there. When I mention them, if you say to yourself, I want to know who on earth you're talking about, so let me know. For example, in 2018, not everybody has a good idea who Sigmund Freud was. So if you want me to tell you things, I'll tell you. And if you want to go on, we'll go on. You have a good sense of who Freud was? Everybody in this is the only class in the world where everybody knows who Freud is. But if you know, then we'll go on. Freud, as you know, was born in 1856. So this case was conducted when he was 50 years old. And he was working in psychoanalysis for about 20 years. And he had another 30 years to go. Freud had Yamim. He was an Alpiyid. He lived a long life. That allowed him to change his mind about practically everything. And this case was one of the cases that helped him to change his mind, because in some ways he blew it, and he managed to recoup, but it's the first time that Freud tried to treat a child. Now, Freud knew everything about childhood and nothing about childhood, because first of all, he had 6 kids, so he knew a lot about childhood. He knew everything about childhood because he was hearing about memories that connected to childhood, early childhood, from all of his patients. And most of his patients were in their late teens or early 20s, and most of them were women. He knew nothing about childhood because he had never spoken to a child, and he had actually no idea how to bridge between what you do in psychoanalysis and talking to a child. And why would that be? Because psychoanalysis, and you'll see that we'll be dealing with this all the time, psychoanalysis is indirect communication. Indirect communication. Everything that you can say, come on in, everything that you know and that you can say is considered to be, okay, we'll start with that, but that's not where we're going. Everything that you can't say, everything that you don't yet know, things that haven't occurred to you yet and that you don't have control over, conscious control over, that's what psychoanalysis looks for. So how do you talk indirectly to a child? Everybody talks directly to a child, right? That's why Freud never spoke to children. But one of his associates was a family. In those days, you know, in Jewish Vienna, psychoanalysis was pretty much a Jewish enterprise at the time. Freud was trying to make it a little bit less Jewish, but it was a very Jewish enterprise. And the people who came were people in not a very large community. And what happened is that the people in the community got interested in psychoanalysis. The first thing that interests you in psychoanalysis is yourself. That's the first thing that interests you. So everybody became Freud's patient. And Freud psychoanalyzed half of Vienna, of that little crowd. And then his disciples were people who he had performed psychoanalysis on, including the mother of this little boy. And the father was one of Freud's associates or students. So it's all very small little crowd. And it's important to remember that when we look at the case. This wasn't, Professor Freud was not world famous in 1906. He thought he might be someday, but he was very, very far from it. He was in the fringes in Vienna. Anybody who had anything to do with mental health in Vienna, neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, had absolutely nothing to do with Freud. If you studied psychology in Vienna, including in the 1920s, they never mentioned his name. He was in Chayrim because he said things that people didn't like. And that's still the case. Anyway, it's in a small crowd, and small chatzer, if you will. And this little boy named Hans was born to parents, as I said, who were in Freud's crowd. And here you see a genogram. Is everybody here familiar with genograms? Genograms began in family therapy? No. Genograms began with genes, right? In other words, geneticists drew genograms. That's where it comes from. And family therapists adopted it. In English, at least, you go from left to right, giving privilege, as we say these days, to men. Men sit at the top of on the left, because English is read from left to right, so you start with the men. One might change that these days, but there's the father, okay? And men are all rectilinear. Now that should make sense, at least to the right side of the room, hopefully also to the left. Men are square, right? So the rectilinear squares are men, and women have a more round way of approaching life. So you have a couple, the line that goes across under them, that's the fact that they're married. And then they have two children, okay? The first is Hans, and the second is Hannah. Naturally, these names are made up, but in Freud's Vienna, everybody knew who they were talking about. They were all their neighbors. There were no secrets. And if it was in 2018, one would probably say to Freud, you know, you really can't publish this case because there's no real secrecy. And I say that because the truth is that one of the dilemmas that we're going to have over years is that we can't publish our cases. Har Nof, or Israel, or the Jerusalem is too small. And so when you have information and you want to communicate it, it's a real problem in Jerusalem how to do that. It's too small a community. But Freud, you know, that was a long time ago, and these were his people. Now, Hans was a precocious, friendly little boy for most of his life, and the event that happened when he was 3.5. Now, what's the 3.5 doing here? What we're doing and what we'll be doing all through the year is combining a genogram, which is a picture of what, a picture without time, with a timeline. You see, under Hans, we have his timeline, and under Hannah, we have her timeline. He's 3.5 and she's born. If you wanted to expand it, you could have a line for the father and how old he was, and a line for the mother and how old she was. And then what you can do is essentially take the genogram and take it through time. Walk it through time and see, okay, Hans is 3.5 when Hannah is born. When Hans is 18.5, how old will Hannah be? Right? You just walk it through and you see that she's 15. And if this was not Vienna but Jerusalem, and if when Hans is 18, he then goes into the army, so we would be able to map that when when Hannah is 15, the family is going to change because her older brother is going to go into the army, right? So you can map not just the past, you can map the future. You can see where the changes are going to take place and what they might look like, and you could put in the ages of the father and the mother. You can find the ages of the father and the mother and say, okay, I think that when the father is approaching 50, there's going to be a big change because Hans is going to be 18 and she's going to be 15 and so forth. You can map it. So Hans is 3.5 and his sister is born. And he seems to not like the fact that he has a younger sister, and he states it in an indirect way. He does a few things that make her a little bit, her health precarious. He does it in a way that's indirect. Like most little children, we have a lot of people here with little children, you know, so when number 2 or number 6, whatever, is born, so number 5 or number 1 loves the baby to death. In other words, there's hugs that you need to say, that was a little much, right? So the little much means that this baby is more than just a pleasure for you. There's some other meaning to it. And the other meaning is what we're going to be looking at. So Hans, a year and a quarter later, he was born in April. So the summer after that, at 4:45, when Hannah is really getting in his way because she's, little babies, they don't do much, so they don't threaten you too much, then they start to do a lot, and then things get tough for the older children. So when Hannah starts to be more of a person, Hans starts to be afraid of horses. Horses! He can't go out of the house. When he sees that there's a horse, he gets scared. He won't cross the street. Naturally, this is before the automobile, so he can't be afraid of trucks. He's afraid of horses. And maybe the horse fell down, maybe the horse will eat him, maybe the horse will bite him. And so Hans becomes ill for about a year and won't go out of the house. And Hans's father goes to the professor, that's how people talk in Vienna and Jerusalem, and say, Professor, I think I have something interesting to tell you. So the professor says, oh, this is the first time I'm not hearing about childhood indirectly from the past. Here it is online, childhood. Tell me what's going on. He says, oh, my son has this phobia. And he won't go out of the house. And Freud starts to ask him about the meaning of the phobia. And Freud starts to guide the father, says, well, ask him this and tell him that. And at some point, Freud says to the father, here's the deal. This is just a proof of what I wrote. Freud liked to prove what he wrote. Not only Freud. Everybody loves to prove what they write. And that's one of the foibles that we have. You will love to hear from your patients what you've learned. You have to be careful, right? Because it might be part of the truth, but not all of the truth. Freud was sure, okay, this is my new innovation. You have to tell Hans that he's afraid. Why is he afraid of horses? Because the horses symbolize his father, and there was some reasons to think that was the case. And he's afraid that his father is going to bite him or punish him because he's 4 3/4, and he wants to take his mother away from his father. And so you've heard of that, right? That's the Oedipal complex, that the little boys around the age of 3, mainly 4 is the middle of it, they start to think that it's possible to take mother away from father. And then when they have that thought, they become frightened that father's not going to like that, and so they get confused. So Freud said, it's pretty easy to unconfuse your little boy Hans. Just tell him the results of psychoanalysis, that's what little boys wish. So the father did that, and Hans, being a very bright boy, said, well, thank you very much, and didn't change anything. And so the father said to Freud, how about if I bring this boy to you? Freud was curious to see the boy, but he had no technique of children. Next class, you're going to start a course with Barbara Reicher on how to talk to children. Because you can't do family therapy if you're afraid to bring the kids in. Freud wasn't afraid to bring the boy in, but he blew it. It's good to be a little afraid, but how you talk clinically with children is not the same as being a parent, because parents or educators speak directly, and therapists speak indirectly. How to speak indirectly with children, how to listen to them in a different way, you're going to have a whole semester on that. That allows people to become actual family therapists. In other words, the therapist is not afraid to say, bring in your kid and let's, see him all together. So that's the course that's going to be the first semester in parallel with this course. So Freud didn't have that course. Actually, the truth is that it's thanks to Freud that we can have the course now, but it took a long time. So the boy came in, and Freud said to the boy, listen, son, he spoke to him directly. He said, I knew even before you were born that there would be a little Hans who at some point would be scared by things that he had on his mind, things that passed through his mind and his heart, that he was afraid that they were his, but he was afraid of them, and that don't worry, you'll grow out of it. All little boys are like that. Does that sound like good child therapy? It's all direct, right? So that didn't work. And then Hans whispered to his father after he left the room. He said, tell me something. Does the professor talk to God? Now, the father reported it, and Freud said, Is that a compliment? I don't think so. I think I blew it, because I said I know before you were born. So now if you know it all, there's no process of exploring. And if you know it all, there's no process in which the client is your partner in exploring. And what happens in all therapies is the client is the leader, right? In other words, we needed Hans to come to that conclusion himself. But since Freud gave him the conclusion and didn't exercise a process, so he blew it. And then time went on, and the rest of it, I'll leave for you to read. No, it's not in the reader. It's a long case. It's 100 pages long. So if you want to spend an afternoon enjoying something, it's Freud at his best and at his worst. Freud is always at his best when he's at his worst. In other words, he's exuberant. And as a result, he oversteps things, but he's thinking and something new comes out of it, but not something that's going to stay that way. The one thing that is important to appreciate about all theories and all therapeutic techniques is that they're movements. It's energy, it's not content. So Freud is at his best when he's in motion. He makes a lot of mistakes, but it goes somewhere. And that's what it's like doing therapy too. You'll make a lot of mistakes. You'll get exuberant, you'll think you'll know something, and then the next time around you'll say to yourself either Gewalt, I made a mistake, or oh great, I'm moving ahead, something new has happened, and I can go from there to the next thing. Clients don't die from mistakes. They die from therapists who are afraid of mistakes. You have to be able to move with your client, and then if it's a mistake, the best thing you can do with a client is to say, I think that was a mistake. Then you can move ahead with them. Now, Freud attracted everybody except doctors. He had a real problem with doctors. He attracted 2 psychiatrists and then fought with both of them. One was Alfred Adler, who was Jewish, and the other was Carl Jung, who was not Jewish. And Freud thought maybe Jung is going to save us from psychoanalysis just being a Jewish enterprise. In case you don't know, in Vienna, in 1906, the mayor of Vienna was from what was known as the anti-Semitic party. Jews were not popular in Vienna. They were a big part of Vienna. They had their own neighborhood, but there was the actual party that was anti-Jewish. That was the mayor. So Freud was trying to get psychoanalysis to be science, and he attracted all kinds of people. He attracted writers, he attracted poets, and he attracted one physicist named Robert Welder. Robert Welder was a physicist at the best place in the world then, which was the Max Planck Institute and in Berlin. And what was happening in 1906? The very beginnings of quantum thinking. As you know, the first half of the 20th century, science moved from content to process and from matter to energy, relativity and quantum physics. So in comes Robert Welder, and in the 20s, he's hanging around in Freud's little crowd, and he gets an idea that comes from quantum physics. And what Robert Welder brought to psychoanalysis is what we're going to learn now. And that's the article that, when you have time, you can try to read. It's called The Principle of Multiple Function. Let me try to explain to you how this has to do with indirect communication, how it has to do with movement, and how it has to do with mistakes. Robert Welder suggested that there are 4 pairs of meanings. The first pair of meaning is what drives us from within. Now, what he said was, people are not simple systems. There are no simple systems in biology. Those of you who have studied physics know that the way to make progress in physics is what's called a simple system. You simply ignore everything except one atom and one, light thing, and you study it for 50 years, and you make a small little contribution and say, I don't know what this has to do with reality, but that's how it is. You restrict your view. In biology, there's no such thing as a simple system. So what Velder suggested is that how do you deal with a complex system and still be able to deal with it? Because the easiest thing is to say, oh, it's chaos. That's popular these days, right? Chaos theory. So you say, it's a mess, and go home. That doesn't get you very far. So Velder suggested that the biological system, or the psychic system, is complex in a way that's possible to understand the complexity. Not to reduce the complexity, but to understand the complexity. So he built a map, and the map has 4 lines, and each line has 2 sides. The first line are what are called the drives. That was poorly translated Freud was translated into English by people who wanted to, in some ways, dilute some of his crazier ideas. So the word Trieb in German, which is a drive, they translate it as instincts. It's drives. It's a description of something that pushes you. If you want, you're familiar with the idea of V8 Sahara, it's not far from that. In other words, it's something that's part of you, not all of you, that you have to figure out what part to deal with it, but it's there. In other words, you can't say it's not me, but in some ways it's not me, it's not all of me, and it's not what I usually think or how I would like to define myself, but it's there. So the drives are things that you feel pushed by. I think most people can figure out what Freud had in mind, right? There's a drive, sexual drives, of course, but not only. Drives to get something that you want. But Freud said that, in the system of the drives, there's also the reaction to the drive. And the reaction to the drive is what's called the response of the ego to the drives. Now, Freud didn't use the word ego. He used the word I. In German, it's ich. And the translation of ego is a bit of a problem also. Just think of I means, what do I think of myself? When I say it's me, the part of me where I say, this is who I identify with, that's me. That's the I. Maybe we'll call it the I instead of the ego and get closer to Freud's way of talking. But the I says to the drives, wait a minute. You don't control everything. Now, what's important to understand is that the I doesn't say to the drives, get out of here. It doesn't say, this is a war to extinction. The I never says to the drives, I'm going to annihilate you, because the I needs the drives. There are things in Chazal that say the same thing about, the world won't exist if there's no Yetzirah. If human beings have drives, and they deal with the drives. So the ego is figuring out what to do with the drives and trying to make a compromise with the drives. As a result, we have a system which is complex, right? You can't talk only about the drives. You can't talk about the ego separate from the drives, but you can talk about the deal that they make together.
Are drives necessarily negative?
No. I'll start. Thank you. The question is, are the drives necessarily negative? Nothing is necessarily negative. Nothing. It's facts. It's what you got. The question is what you do with it. So, in essence, it's one of the things that makes psychoanalysis, as it were, a problem. The religious world sometimes recoils from Freud over that question and says, well, what do you mean the drives aren't negative? Of course they're negative, right? You have to get rid of them. But not everybody in religious thinking thinks that either, that you have to, destroy the drives, because nobody believes you can, But the question is how you deal with them and what you make of them, how you channel them, and how you make them something that's that you want it to be instead of something you don't want it to be. So it's work, right? Now, if you look at that, there we go. The second system, it's a different system, is the conscious, the conscience, what Freud called the superego. When Freud spoke of the superego, it's a bad translation, but it's close to the German. It's something that's over the ego. Over, what he means is sort of a spatial kind of metaphor. There's the ego, and something that sits on top of the ego, that monitors the ego. In other words, something which I look at myself from above, not from just within, from above. the superego has two parts, not just conscience. The first part is the part that we're used to thinking about, which is conscience. You know, you have a bad conscience, you feel guilty about something. But the superego also includes aspirations for who I might be. That part is called the ego ideal. And that's it's sort of like a yes and no. In the superego, there's a voice of no, which is conscience. Stop that, that's not good. And a voice that says, yes, this is how it should be. And so those two parts are parts of the superego. So there's, in little Hans, a sense that he might be guilty, a sense that he might be doing something wrong. But then the ego discusses something with the superego. The ego says to the conscience, wait a minute, let's make a deal. Why? Because the conscience, and here's something that the religious world never forgave Freud for. Freud liked to say the conscience doesn't come from above, because Freud was a free thinker. He didn't think anything came from above. He said conscience doesn't come from above, it comes from below. It's informed by energy of the drives. And so sometimes it acts like a drive. And if the superego, the conscience, is acting like a drive, it's going to do bad things to you. Now, we're not going to solve theological problems here, but some aspects of conscience are a problem. Even in the religious world, you know, you can have a conscience that makes you miserable and ruins your life. Why would that be a good thing? And that conscience, you would say, is, wait a minute, that's sort of a childish conscience. That's a conscience that says you need to be punished now, and the punishment is death. There's only one punishment, that you deserve to die. That would be a childish or a drive-driven kind of conscience. The conscience grows up too. It doesn't begin adult. The conscience grows together with all the other parts of the personality. So the superego may be saying, look, if you've had that thought, if that's what you wanted, if that's a part of you, then you need to die. So the ego says, wait a minute, we could make a deal. We could make a deal. We can find a way that you can suffer, but not have to die. We'll describe it in a second. We'll go through the, yeah.
Can you understand about the conscious? I didn't
What?
The conscious.
Conscience.
Yeah, I didn't understand that.
Right. The conscience?
Yeah.
The conscience is, let's say, the origins of conscience is that a little boy wants to take a cookie, and he hasn't eaten lunch yet, and his mother says to him, no. Now, the voice of no is not natural. Natural is to want the cookie. Unnatural is to say no. It comes from outside, right? And then, because you're in relationship all the time, and because you take in relationships in ways that we'll talk about, so when mother says no, the child ultimately learns to say to himself, no, right? Now, how does the mother say no? The way that the mother says no is the way the child will talk to himself later, right? Not just the no, but if mother says, no, you did it again, I can't, the child will approach himself over time and say, you're bad, you're always doing that. And if mother says to him, no, honey, you goofed. Remember we talked just 3 seconds ago that first we're going to eat, and then we're going to do that, and you can learn how to do that too. Then the child will say no to himself in the same way. He'll say, look, sweetheart, you want things that you can't necessarily have. So that's the conscience. The conscience says, you want something, the answer is no. If the answer is yes, it's good to get good grades, right? How do you get good grades? By saying no? I haven't met anybody who got good grades by saying no. You have to say yes. I want to be somebody. That's another part of the superego. The conscience part is the no. Okay? So, and then just to, yeah.
The part I didn't understand was about the you deserve to die part because we're failing.
I'm sorry, what?
The part that you said that the superego says you deserve to die
Right.
because you failed. So, but that's unconscious. People don't usually think that.
Okay. So the word the question is, what's conscience or consciousness?
Well, both. I guess I'm asking like how that fits.
Right. But in French, it's the same word. Conscience means both consciousness and conscience. In English, when we say conscience, we mean what we call matspun, right? It's the voice of no. Now, what the question was, well, wait a minute, is the superego always conscious, right? You have a conscience, a voice of no. Do you know about it, or does it sort of walk automatically and you don't know about it? And the answer is both, right? In other words, there's a part of the superego that one would like to say it's all conscious, but if you look at yourself, which is the best place to look, you see that a lot of times you're holding yourself, restraining yourself and saying no, and you're not aware of it. It becomes sort of automatic, and you're not aware actually of why. And maybe it was, a good thing when you were 4, but not a good thing when you were 24. And so there are parts of the superego that are unconscious, right? And as a result, in psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis, you would think it's all about the drives. No. A fair bit of psychoanalysis is what's called superego analysis. Superego analysis is look at the way you're saying no to yourself. Look at the way you're treating yourself. Look at the way that you're getting down on yourself. Look at the way that you're saying, you can't want that. Why are you doing that, right? And I didn't know I was doing that. So that's where the whole issue of consciousness becomes interesting. Yeah.
Consciousness, conscience, if it comes from a voice from like a parent that's in us, like automatic, then it's a super, like it's probably from the super. If it's more of a choice, like from a spiritual place, like I don't want to do that because of Torah, because of Hashem. Is that the same? Is this the same, or does it come from the same?
Okay. The question is, the drives seem to come from inside of us, right? The voice of no isn't natural, doesn't come from inside. It comes from around us, it comes from other people. And then it works in a different way because it's more relational, it's more connected to people. That's true. In other words, if you say, what is the voice of the drive that makes you want to drive 200 kilometers an hour? That's a drive. It's a drive in driving, but it's a drive, right? What is that makes you want to do that? Probably it comes from inside of you, unless your father was like that. My father was like that. So I had to, but usually it comes because it's an excitement, right? So it comes from inside of me. The voice that says, don't do that, comes from somebody else, right? That you don't immediately say to yourself, no, that's probably not a good idea. Somebody told you to stop. Maybe it was the police, right? But somebody told you to stop, but it becomes part of you. And one of the ways that we'll be looking at in family therapy, which is interesting, is how it becomes part of you. Because it becomes part of you as part of the family, right? So, does that give you an answer to the question? No. Sort of? Okay. So let's just go on and build the map. Yeah. Well,
Go answer the same question. Like, consciousness is something that gets implanted you from the outside?
no. Conscience. Matspun.
Conscience.
The voice of no comes from the outside.
But how could a voice be only no if it can't give a yes?
No,
It's just
how can a voice...
programmed to say no.
Right. Okay, so here we're getting into an interesting question which you will be dealing with your clients all the time. They'll ask you that also, right? First of all, there's a question of what do we mean by consciousness, right? When we say something's conscious or non-conscious. There's a big fight about that in the mental health realm, so we don't want to ignore that. There are colleagues who say that's a useless term. It's a useless term. There's no such thing as something unconscious. Whatever is there is conscious. Whatever is unconscious isn't there. It's not unconscious. It's just not there. That actually is the voice of the dominant theme in psychology today. It's obviously not the voice that I'm teaching you. It's not the voice that I think speaks to me, but it may speak to you. That's the dominant voice these days. I don't think it will be in 20 years, because in brain science we have ways of defining the unconscious now. We can see it working in the brain, so we're a little less sure that you can just wipe out the unconscious. But the unconscious processes are unconscious. So there we have the basic conundrum of indirect communication. How can you speak consciously about something that's unconscious? Either it's there or it's not, right? So the way to find out about the unconscious is indirect communication, right? Now, indirectly, you may find out, how do you do indirect communication with yourself? You write down your dreams, and you pay attention to them. And you say, what am I saying to myself in my sleep that I'm not able to say to myself when I'm awake? That doesn't sound like a heretical idea, because we do different things in our dreams than we do when we're awake. And so you find that there's parts of me that I was acting as if something's telling me no or yes, and I didn't realize it. I find it indirectly, and then it dawns on me, and then it becomes conscious. So once people have that experience of the unconscious becoming conscious, and I didn't realize it. I find it indirectly, and then it dawns on me, and then it becomes conscious. So once people have that experience of the unconscious becoming conscious, they stop asking, is there an unconscious? Because it's there, they felt it. Before you've had that experience, or if you refuse to allow that experience, or if you devalue that experience and say only what's good, so you'll never find it. So that's why the dominant voice these days is if you don't look for it, you won't find it. So don't look for it, don't find it, and it doesn't exist. We're going into indirect communication with ourselves and with people, and there we find this question, which philosophically can't be solved. It's impossible to see. So you're asking in some way a philosophical question. How would you define the unconscious? Well, all philosophical tools are conscious. That's how it works. It has to do with conscious thinking. So those tools cannot give a definition to the unconscious, right?
I thought that you were saying that superego is another part. That means a person has a drive, he has the I, and then he has consciousness.
That's like conscience, not consciousness. Consciousness, conscience, right?
A conscience. That
Right.
could be either conscious,
Or unconscious.
either he could be aware of it or can't be aware of it.
Right.
But there is this part of us that has a conscience. So,
Right.
so why is it only no?
It isn't only no. The voice of no is what we call the conscience. The ego ideal is the one that says yes. They both live in the superego. That's what I said before, that when we talk about the superego, it includes the no and the yes. We give one name to the no and one name to the yes, but they're both there.
Both part of it.
An easier way to remember these things, Freud was a neurologist. Neurologists that Freud wasn't a psychiatrist? Psychiatrists hated Freud, except for the ones that came in and then left and hated him. But psychiatrists were never friendly with Freud. And he was a neurologist. He was one great neurologist. The book that he wrote on cerebral palsy is still studied today in Germany because it's a marvelous description. Freud was a great doctor. You can't take that away from him. Crazy ideas, some of which are not so crazy, but a great doctor. Neurologists deal with functions. They look for places in the brain that are connected to functions that go together. When Freud was talking about the superego, he was talking about functions that go together. They tend to run together. So this voice of yes and this voice of no tend to be connected and run together. And the voice of how am I going to deal with this in reality is a function that runs together. So the ego is not somebody. The ego is a collection of functions that happen. And it makes it much easier to understand it that way if you don't look at it as these little animals running around in your head, but it's collections of functions. And Freud once said, when you're feeling good, all the functions go together. You don't separate them, right? You had a good morning, you woke up, you felt good, your kids got to school on time, you had a cup of coffee, you talked with your spouse, things feel good. Go and break that down into ego and superego? You can't. Freud said that these are lines of division. When things crack, that's where they crack. Because people who came to Freud were cracked, right? They had neurosis and something wasn't working. When something isn't working, you can see how the functions tend to divide. In the healthy personality, it's one of the things that makes it hard to understand Freud. You look at yourself and say, wait a minute, that didn't happen to me today. I didn't have any fights with myself this morning. Why should I? And Freud would say, you shouldn't. A healthy personality doesn't have to divide these functions. They flow together. When things get difficult, that's when they break apart, right? So that's the idea of these different functions. Okay, let me just say one thing. We are going to go at your pace. One of the reasons that I spread this course over a year is that I want these questions. And what I don't want to do is to run past any of the thoughts that you have. Now, this is not a course on Freud. But it is a course on therapy, and a course on therapy is always about direct and indirect communication. And one of the issues in family therapy is when direct and when indirect, and if indirect, how indirect. So we want to include thinking about the indirect communication, even if it doesn't seem like we're moving chairs and making family therapy. We'll get there. Yeah,
So, yeah, we said that the ego is a part of me I think of as me, but the superego includes the ego ideal, which is also the part of me like I want to be. So now I'm confused about how what the ego function is separate to the super.
okay. The question is, what's the ego and what's the super? The superego is what I want to be. See,
Part of it.
okay, part of it, right? The ego runs around not thinking about itself. In a normal day, the ego does things like it tests reality. Let's say this, the alarm clock rings in the morning. The ego says, what time is it? The drives say, I don't want to know what time it is. The superego says, you have to know what time it is if you're in a fight with yourself. If you're not in a fight with yourself, the ego says, oh, it's 6, it's time to get up. That's who does it, it's a function. And then the ego does something synthetic, puts things together. It's, oh, it's 6, I get up, I do this, this is this, this is this. You're not in a fight with yourself, right? Those are the functions that go along and maintain our day-to-day existence and make us work. Those are ego functions. There is no ego other than the functions of the ego. It's a collection of functions, right? When you say to yourself, it's 6, by 7 such and so has to happen. So you're anticipating something, ego function. You say to yourself, at 7 I think the bus is coming, but it may not be. So you're testing reality and you're thinking about possibilities, ego functions. All of those are ego functions, and you say to yourself, nothing. You don't have to say something to yourself when the ego is functioning well. It's like your temperature. I hope everybody here has a body temperature of roughly 37 degrees centigrade. If it is, you don't know what your body temperature is, and you haven't felt it at all. Although, maybe without the fan you would feel it more. But you don't feel your temperature when it's in balance, right? So the ego functions smoothly, and you don't know about it until something is pressing you, right? Something's pressing you like, I want to sleep another hour, I'm exhausted, and it's because of so-and-so, so now you're in interesting...
It can be pressed by the drive or by the superego.
That's right. The ego lives in communication with the... But just to correct, you corrected yourself, the superego includes yes and no. Yeah, the ego ideal is the yes part, and the conscience is the no part. And both of them may be conscious, not so conscious, or unconscious. You had a question?
Yeah. So according to this theory, there's no such thing as an inner sense of morality.
Say that again?
According to this theory, the superego is things that are taught to us externally. There's no sense of an inner sense of morality, like it's wrong to kill. That has to be taught.
In Freud's way of looking at people, it's the question was morality. Does it have to be taught? Freud's view is yes. Morality is something that you're taught and that you assimilate from the outside. Now, pay attention to one thing.
Just thinking of Cain and Hevel.
What was your thought about Cain and Hevel?
Well, I mean, it was just this week's Parsha, so I was just thinking, like, he wasn't taught maybe that it was wrong to kill. It was his drive to kill.
Right. It's not just Cain and Hevel, it's also Eitzadar. But depending how you look at it. But the important part to realize is that Freud was thinking about the individual separately. So when he saw people saying no, he saw that as external to the person. Children actually don't feel it that way, do they? Right? Children feel that what their parents tell them is not external to them, it's part of who they are. Right? Freud's way of looking at the individual was extreme. Right? When you look at it in the extreme, you say there's an individual, and then what impacts on it? So then you say there's the inner and the outer world. The truth is that people live in a human world, right? And when you say there's an I, so there's an I, but there's also a we. The notion of we was missing in Freud. That's why your question is right on target for where we're going. Freud didn't have a we. He thought that was something that develops later. But basically there's an I, and that's what you deal with the I. Children, when they say no, they're feeling a we. They're feeling part of something. Part of what? Our family, right? Why do you think there's a big fight between family therapy and Freud, and Freudians? Because we're dealing with a we. We're not saying there's no I, but we are saying that, wait a minute, that experience of something from the outside, it's not exactly from the outside. It depends how you look at it. If you look at it as a we, it's a we that's working well. Why do you want to see it as something that's impinging from the child? But from the child's point of view, put it this way, when it works well, you can't divide the I from the we in a family. And you don't have to, right? We've all hopefully had experiences when things go well in the family, and you don't have to separate who's who. But when things are problematic, and all of the people who come to us looking for help have some kind of a problem in themselves and in the we. So then, if the we is not working, then you have to learn how to work with it, directly and indirectly. But it's a very important question, because, you know, if you say it's outside, you're saying there's no we. That's
But even if we say there's a we, you're still saying that the morality is taught from the parents, which are part of us.
Oh yeah, I mean, it comes.
There's no intrinsic, according to this, inner sense of morality.
Freud's view was that nothing comes from above, and if it all comes from below, then it comes from interactions. That was Freud's view. You can learn a lot from Freud and not accept that. But let's put it this way, some of it comes from below, right? The question of where it all comes from is a philosophical or theological question. Freud didn't go there. But, and there was one more question? Yeah.
It's not so much a question, I think it's more.
But I need to hear it.
It's not so much a question, just more of a clarification.
Even better.
I think the confusion maybe is just because of the way the trajectory
We have to test reality, 1 second. That's the outside. There's a we that's trying to do something, and the outside is bothering us. Go away. Now, if we're all thinking like children magically, like little hands, I said go away, went away. Go ahead.
Just the trajectory in terms of how I learned it, like in terms of this would be the structural theory, because Freud had many different theories that he spoke about, and they really all intertwine, and that's why it's confusing. But in terms of the structural, when you're talking about the this is topographic, sorry. When you're talking about topographic, you have the id, the ego, and then the superego, so the id is driven by the libidinal and aggressive forces.
Driven by Can everybody else hear?
The id, when you have, meaning the id is the drives.
Right.
And then the drives are forced by the libidinal and aggressive forces, which is inborn. And then you have the superego, which is only developed post-Oedipal. Meaning pre-Oedipal, the superego is in its forming, but only once they have the Oedipal complex do you really have the formation of the superego. This is how I read it. I'm not.
Right.
So that's why it's coming externally. So when you see a client and they have a harsh superego versus a more benign or flexible superego, then you can work with them based on that, but you know that it came from that interaction or from the internalized parent interaction or the environment or religion, society, like everything external. Then comes the ego, and I think also the observing ego is what's confusing when we're talking about conscience, because the observing ego is the ability to reflect outside yourself, sort of like, you know, when people talk about those near-death experiences, when they're like looking down upon themselves. And I think that's when the observing ego is saying, I'm doing this, like I'm in the moment when we give a client awareness of what's going on and what they're acting. Because this, I'm sorry if I'm a little bit scattered, but the superego is the same thing as the ego ideal, which is what I want to be this. And that's developed post-Oedipally, and that,
Yeah.
sorry. And then the ego is constantly modulating between the drives and the superego. So if somebody has the harsh superego, then they say, no, you can't have the cookie. But if they have the benign superego, they'll say, yes, you could have the cookie, and then they'll overly indulge. And that's why you need the ego to come in and say, no, you can't have too much. Like you can't have too much, or you can't have too little. And it goes back and forth, and then if there's too much conflict, I think what happens then is that it impedes on the ego functioning. And and that was the other question of the 12 ego functions, like the judgment, the object relations, and different things that the ego is control of. I'm sorry if I'm confusing, but I think maybe more like understanding more of Freud's other theories can help explain, like you said before, sometimes when you look at one thing and then you can't see all of it, so maybe that's where the confusion is.
So let me try to summarize what I can do. What you're asking as a clarification is, I hope you heard, I'm not going to repeat it all. Robert Velder had a student named Otto Fennekel. Otto Fennekel moved to Chicago, and Otto Fennekel in Chicago wrote the classic English book on psychoanalytic theory, and you just summarized it. In other words, there are theoreticians in psychoanalysis who are extraordinary at making a system look organized. The reason I'm not going to go into all of it is because actually nobody believes that now. In other words, it's a marvelous structure for thinking. When you see your clients, you stumble over it. You know, the American psychoanalysts stumbled over that for about 30 or 40 years because the view, you see, I think your superego is here, and I think, you know, this is functioning that. You're treating your patient as an exterior object, right? You're understanding, psychoanalyzing what's going on in them, but not paying attention to what's going on between us, right? And these days, psychoanalysis has moved more to the relational, not just as transference. We'll get to that, you know, in time. But to say it's a two-person system. There's a we. Somebody walks into the room. There's a we. Two people walk into the room. There's a couple of we's, right? And what goes on in the we is more useful than trying to conceptualize all of those things about there's me here and there's you there, and I'm going to tell you how you are. So few people work that way. It's, what you summarize is it was dominant in America. It was called ego psychology, and it had, you know, there was a structural theory and the dynamic theory and the topographic theory, which we're not going to all go into. But it's what you're asking for clarification is, I think, how do we use any of that these days? Where has that gone now? That didn't. There were two major schools that moved away from that, criticized it. One was in England and then in South America, through the school of Melanie Klein, which doesn't use that model. And the other is the French school of Jacques Lacan, which hates that model. There's a big war about it. So in 2018, that's sort of, you know, people will teach you that that's the model of psychoanalysis, but that's sort of a sketch, which is not the full story, certainly how it is now. What I wanted to get to was to understand that things have multiple functions, and we'll pick that up again next time. But the main thing I wanted to use poor little Hans for is to understand that if we look at his sphere of forces, we can divide it into a chart of 4 by 2. This is the whole chart, and I'll explain it to you next time. We'll get into it next time, because they were very good questions and I want to stay with our pace. But the main idea is that the same sphere of forces can be understood as an expression of the drive and as a compensation to the drive. It can be understood as an expression of the conscience and as a way of handling the conscience, something in reality and as something that's managing reality in a different way, and something that tends to repeat itself, and how you manage that. So there's an and and an and and an and and an and. That's the model. Now what we want to do is learn something about ourselves in that model. What we're going to do is take about 20 minutes to break up into the women stay here, the men come with me to the other room. And I want to show you something for which I need to. Here's the task. See this picture? This is a This is a painting by Paul Klee, 1929. It's called Argument. And what I would like you to do, I'll have a smaller version of this for the men in the other room on my computer. Look at it, divide into groups. We're going to be doing that each session. Divide into dyads and tell each other what you see in this picture. And spend about 10 minutes telling each other what you see in the picture. Then tell each other what it was like to tell each other. And then what you think you learned from the exercise. And then we will come back at 20 of 11 for another 10 minutes to try to put together what we think we've learned from the exercise. But first of all, it's very important for all of the exercises that you talk in pairs. Everybody gets involved that way. Tell each other what you see. This is a picture, but it has more than one meaning. And we'll see you again. Dina's going to help you, and Shira. You all know Shira? Shira and Dina are going to work together with the women on the exercises. The men will come with me. And tell each other what you see. Tell each other what it was like to see different things. Then we'll come back together to 20 of them. Let me just say, I hope you've got a sense of the pace of this room. We're not running anywhere, but we need all the time we have. We were a little pressed to get to the exercise today because we didn't start on time. So that's a way of saying thank you to everybody who came at 9. Half a thanks for the ones who came at 9:10, and everybody else is invited to have a big thank you next week at 9. What would you like to communicate between the two groups, between the men and the women, about what you learned about the in the exercise? What you learned in the exercise? Something that, there's a question of whether it's comfortable to communicate between the genders. I'm going to look this from you. Yes.
I can just say one thing, that if we women saw it so differently in our group, and we all saw such different parts of it, and we're sure that the men saw it even more, different how we talked about it today. Like the men are represented in the squares and the women in circles. So just for the same exercise, they would have such different answers.
Okay. Is there something about what you learned in the women's group that you would like to let the men know about? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that. You assume that the discussions are rather different between the men and the women. Okay. Something that you want to communicate? Something, yeah.
I think the overall thing that people were saying is that people see things very differently. And people come from different places. So when working with clients, we should all be aware of that. I think that was
Okay. And that's something that you felt you took from the exercise. Because you kind of knew it before, but the point of the exercise is to experience it. So it's an experience of the fact that something that isn't so clear, like life, families, clients, that there's going to be different takes on them, and that they all contribute something to it. And you can't make total perfect sense out of it, but you can choose what's meaningful and to move with it. Yeah.
I just have a question that popped up. Like, if you wouldn't have said the argument, it's called the argument.
Right.
Like, would that have changed everything?
You tell me. Would it have been different if I hadn't said that the name of the painting was the short argument? In other words, you guys know, behind every good question is an answer, right? So you're suggesting that maybe I shouldn't have told you that. Yeah, it could be.
It was interesting to see because I heard you say that it's a conflict.
Well, I can only hear. It's true that we want to hear all the different themes, but not all at once, because I can't figure it out.
I actually experienced that very much because I heard you say it's a picture of a conflict, so I saw it straight away as a conflict, so I straight away saw two human beings.
Right.
And Shira did not hear you say that, so she was looking at the picture as an art piece. So she saw a complete different picture. She saw shapes and colors and all different things. So,
Right.
So I think that's the biggest proof
That.
that we're shaped by what we're told.
Okay. So there's another interesting kind of insight here, which is that, families come in and tell you what the problem is. And what you're suggesting is that if you can put that aside, sometimes you see something completely different than what they say is the problem. And so language sometimes determines which way you're going to go, and sometimes you need to be able to put the language aside and to see things in a more global way. One last comment, Gabby.
I'd like to suggest a continuation comment. When I first saw it on the board, it didn't look like an argument at all. When we looked at it and examined it, I could see it in more the depth, and there's components, the body language and stuff, I could see the arguments. I feel like sometimes,
Did you
really
hear
have to,
Dr.
what?
Flashman say that it's a conflict, or you didn't?
I heard him say, but when I looked at the picture, I still didn't see the argument.
Good, okay, so you were able to, you had a different experience with language, was it? You could put it
No, but
aside.
then I was able to.
Right. So you were in and out. Gabby's a lawyer, so arguments are what he lives with.
Did anybody see two people working together here?
Okay, so I gather you did.
What?
I gather you did.
No.
I saw the horse
Wait
thing.
a second, Moshe's giving you an interesting example. He said, no, I didn't see it. Did anybody see it? But it's there. He
No,
just
I
said,
saw people juggling different things, and I just looked at it as a clash instead of.
okay, I'll tell you what. Dina needs to talk to you about some stuff. We will begin with the painting next time, and then we'll go from there. I just want to say thank you very much for your attention and your questions, and I feel like we're starting to work together. Hopefully, some arguments and some working together.
Of an adolescent who's 15, who comes from a good family, and the family is very concerned with, thanks for the compliment, with shidduchim, and so he needs to be in a good yeshiva. But he can't learn in the good yeshiva because they're running much faster than it's right for him. Not necessarily because he's dumb, but there's different ways of learning. Once when I bought my Shas in 1970 here in Geula, Israeli publishing in 1970 was this was the Chasam Sofer Shas, and so I had to spend a lot of time with the guy who was selling it to me because I had to turn every page to make sure it wasn't printed upside down or upside down. So we had a lot of time together. And so at one point he was talking to me about the yeshiva I was in. I was asking him about, he was talking about his kids. I said, well, is that a good yeshiva? And he laughed. He said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as a good yeshiva. There's a good yeshiva for somebody, sometime. That's what there is. So that allows a lot of room. But if the shidduchim and the pressure doesn't allow, and you have to have a brother who is in a certain yeshiva, so this poor kid became the janitor in the yeshiva, so that he could be in the yeshiva and nobody was telling that he was the janitor. He was just cleaning. And so you can imagine that it's going to be hard for him to cross the threshold of being an adult if his adolescence is sacrificed for the shidduchim and so forth. That's an unfortunate social cost of some things, but it's a tragedy for some people, and it's an example of something where the kid needs to believe that who I am, which you recall is who I've stitched together, the person that I've been stitching together. I can continue to become who I am, and in the family there's room for me to become who I am, and it may not be exactly the plan. It may not be plan A. It may be not this yeshiva, it may not be exactly this field, it may not be this particular bagrut. In Israeli society right now, secular Israeli society, the chief victims of this are artists, people who are really talented in art and not so much in bagrut. They're not so talented in doing Chamesh Yechidot Mathematica Física. They're not so talented in having the teacher tell them what literature means because they think that they have some ideas too, but you have to run to the bagrut and say what's expected. And some of those kids get the impression that to become an artist is just not being an adult, it's being a kid still. And some of them do the detour and become broken adults in order to become artists because there's no way to be an adult and be an artist. So that's an issue that every society, and here it's not just one part of society, every society has to ask itself, are we overburdening our adolescents? Are we giving them a highway or a narrow path to becoming adults. If it's a narrow path, some people are going to fall who didn't need to. Now, here I want to talk a bit about how to talk with kids. That sort of came up, and I just want to mention it a bit. I'm going to go through a certain way of understanding it. You see a nice Yiddish poem. This is Robert Keegan from Boston, whose work is totally unappreciated in Israel. It's not translated, but it's very important, and it's in the bibliography. Keegan had a certain way of conceptualizing things that's very useful for development. You'll see that it's influenced by Piaget, but also by Anna Freud. I didn't mean to scare you with Piaget. He doesn't bite because he's Swiss, so he leaves you alone. If you look at a baby and you say, who's the me? Who's the me? So a baby has the original experience that the little me is inside my body. In other words, when a baby of 6 months or 8 months, he can't say it, but he hurts his knee. It's not like he says, this is my knee, and it hurts. The knee hurting is bigger than me, right? That's why he needs mommy, right? That changes around the year, 2 years of age, where we get to a situation where instead of the body, me being secondary and in the body, we get to, this is my body. So the me has become, the I has become bigger, and it includes my body. But when a 4-year-old has a strong feeling, like, being upset or being disappointed, and you ask him, what is he feeling? He says, what do you mean, what am I feeling? It's not a me, it's not an I big enough to hold my feelings, but I'm inside my feelings. I'm overwhelmed by my feelings. The feelings are feeling me. He did this and he did that, and you see that the I cannot exactly hold the I. And then when you get to around 11 or 12, after naming endlessly, this is this feeling, this is anger, this is frustration, this is disappointment, and it's your feeling. So the kid not only learns how to declaim it, they can declaim it at 7, but they don't get this point until about 11 or 12, they can say, oh, well, this is how I feel, right? So then, he said, well, are we finished? The I is now pretty big. It includes body and includes feelings. But if you have a conversation with 12-year-olds and you say, well, they say, well, this is how the school should be run. A 12-year-old, I gave you the example before, this is how the school should be run, this, and this, and this. Those are thoughts. So you say, well, let's see whose thoughts those are. Are there any other possibilities? What are you talking about? It sounds like, Popolitica, for those who remember it. I think. So if you think about it, you say, well, wait a second. The I is inside the thoughts. In other words, there were big thoughts, adult thoughts, abstract thoughts, but they don't belong to me. I belong to them. I can't think otherwise. And then, as life advances, and girls get to 20, and boys to 120, you get to the point where the I includes the thoughts. So you say, I had a thought, somebody else could have a different thought. This is the way I was thinking, but it's mine. It's my thought, and it might change because I might change. So you have the growth of the I that includes the body and the feelings and the thoughts. Now, all that is optimal. That's a way of looking at development. But there are some situations where, and the developmental breakdown is one of them, where the I is not big enough for what it's being challenged with. In other words, if you decide that the I can't hold the feelings, or you decide that you don't want to be able to think like an adult, you want to do something different, then you're going to have a situation where you're not going to continue to grow. And there, if you say to yourself, well, when this thing changes, right? See, this is my body, and it's bigger, and then now I'm bigger than my body. How does that happen? Piaget, as you know, was Swiss, so everything happens like clockwork. And Piaget, as you don't know, had a schizophrenic mother So he didn't really rely on other people, so all the development was inside. And so it just happens. You see, this thing just happens. There's no process between people. But if you look at it more closely, you can say, hold on a second. Here. This arrow should be a character. That's an arrow that, sorry, I moved. That arrow should be the other way. I moved it from Hebrew to English and didn't move the arrow. Right. How does it go from one to the other? Is there nothing that also takes place that makes that possible? The change from the small me to the big me. And the answer is, see, because you're talking about that in a lesson with a developmental arrest, right? So if it's developmental shutdown, how do you talk with a developmental shutdown? It's shut, it's developmental. So you got to bring them up. And the answer is, yeah, you're going to bring them up minute by minute. And the way to do that isn't in Piaget, it's in a Jew named Vygotsky, who was really the best developmental theorist of the 20th century. He lived in the Soviet Union. He was a Marxist. He had a little dabble with Kabbalah here and there. And he said something very useful for our clinical understanding of how to deal with the breakdown. And that comes from a very simple notion of building a block tower with a child. A baby is building a tower. He builds a tower of 5 blocks. Everybody's happy, right? And he can't build the tower of 6, right? So when he puts 6, they're knocked down, right? So then Vygotsky said, okay, well in the West, they take what you can't do by yourself and they call that your developmental level, your IQ, what you can't do by yourself. But being a Marxist and also a Jew, he said, who lives by themselves? Nobody lives by themselves. So what about if you take 2 different kids who are right here, and they build 5, I build 5 by myself, and I don't build 6 by myself. So what if we do it together? What if I build 6 together with the kid? There were 2 different kids. One is a kid who, with me, can build 6, and the other is a kid who, with me, can't build 6. So there's a we, and that we is part of the way that things grow. What should we call it? We can do it together. And then Vygotsky said something very true about the West at the time, which is in the West there's no we. So it has to be either you or me. So if the 6th block, whose is it? He says, that's a Klotzkasher, it's ours. So what does it mean that it's ours? You can see that things have developed. Nobody finds that a strange notion now. It's ours, that it's on the way to becoming yours. That's how it becomes yours, that we do it together, you participate in it, and when you participate in it, every teacher knows this intuitively. When you participate in it, then it becomes yours. That's what homework used to be for. What was the idea of homework? That in class, with the teacher explaining it, you got it. We are doing it. By yourself, it's not yet yours. You go home and here's the thing, you say, Mommy, can you give me some help? And if Mommy says, wow, did you understand it in class? Yeah. And you don't understand it now? No. Wow, that's wonderful. What a great teacher. I'm going to be Vygotsky. And I'm going to continue the lesson because it's on the way to be yours because you understood it in class. That doesn't happen very often. You know what usually happens. This teacher's an idiot. What does she give you stuff you didn't understand in class? Either you got it in class or you didn't get it in class. So what am I, your teacher? So it's not usual to get it, but if you get it, then you see that we're on the way. We are on the way. On the way is we. So this is the sort of thing that Vygotsky referred to as the zone of proximal growth. It's a kid who is enjoying tomorrow. I'm going to know this tomorrow. Right now I know it with you. I participate in it. I'm on the way. You can see that as a stitch. You can see that as on the way to a sublimation. You can see that the fun, it comes from the we. It's not just from the I. Anyway, if you see that, then the question is we can do things together. So remember I talked to you about sublimation, about mentalization, which is something that people do together. So you talk to this kid, and he says, let's think about it. He says, no, I never think about anything. And say to him, no, I don't mean that you should think about it. What I mean is that I'm gonna talk to you about how I'm thinking, and come along, let's make a we, right? Because he's used to saying you. So we said, well, I'll tell you how some of us, how I might think about it. Hang on for a couple of seconds, or take your original and hang on for a couple of seconds, but hang on for a couple of seconds. And this is how I might think about it. And you see that the kid is listening. That's all you need to see. To say, oh, we're in Vygotsky land. We're creating something that's the zone of proximal development, something that he's participating in. The moment you stop it, he says, what was that? He said, well, don't worry, we'll do it some more times, because I see that there was something, I looked in your eyes, I had the impression that it wasn't just nonsense. It's not just your way of thinking, and it may not become your way of thinking, but you're taking part in how I'm thinking. You can see how when you're dealing with a kid who has a developmental arrest, that you're dealing with development all the time. But if you sit quietly and say, well, think about it, or, what are your associations, or tell me your dreams, and he says, I don't have any dreams, I don't know what associations are, and I think I'm out of here, right, which we've all seen. So you haven't helped them very much. But if you say, look, we can do things together, but you don't have to lead, you don't even have to agree, you don't have to sign a contract. For example, I know that you went to the emergency room and you took pills, and you're planning to do it again, and you're here because the school says you can't come back until somebody says that you're not going to do it the next minute. Okay. But, what would happen if you said to yourself, I'm going to give this suicide 2 more weeks? Would the suicide still be the same for you if you do it in 2 weeks as opposed to now? Most kids will say, what? The time? Adolescents forget about time. They don't have time. So you say, together, give ourselves 2 weeks. So the average adolescent said, what do I care? I'm going to be dead in 2 weeks. What do I care if I spend 2 weeks with this idiot or not, right? So somebody that makes you happy. So actually, it's important to me. So we have 2 weeks, so we have time. And what do we do in the time? We mentalize. We do things that you can't do by yourself. We don't do it instead of you. We don't do it against you. We do it together so that it's something that you can do together, so that you can grow on the assumption, which is a good assumption, that when the child is taking part in it, we're stitching something. She's stitching something for herself. Something is happening. I'm not going to be able to prove it, but it's a better assumption than either she's already treated or I can't treat her. In the middle, you can always think out loud. So that's where that fits clinically. And I'm just going to, I think I'll end with this slide. We won't get to gender today. Come back soon. I think we're a little over in the concepts anyway. The best way to know if a kid is in movement is to ask if you're in movement. Because we're talking about co-creation. Therapy is co-creation. If a kid is participating with you, you see, we always ask, has the adolescent moved? Has something changed between the beginning and the end of the session? What is the change in him? Do you know? No. What do you know? You can say, has something changed in me? Because when we start to deal with developmental arrests, we deal with our own development. We go back to the age of 12 ourselves. And we say to ourselves, among other things, how on earth did I get through this? There were so many things, what was my way? And if that was missing, could I, so you start with every adolescent, I can just attest to myself that, doing it for 35, 40 years, nothing ever repeats itself. So there's always something to learn. There's always some aspect where you say something, okay, something changed in me. If something changed in me, that probably is a sign that something changed, because what we're talking about is this mutual change. You see the hours growing together? Should I do it one more time? For those of you who missed the show, this is the show. This is the summary of talking with kids with developmental arrest. That something happens to us, that we do something, and the test of it is that I feel that something's happening to me, and that can be summarized in this statue. this is the statue. You see, it's a nice statue of a male and a female figure who are facing each other in eye positions. And here's the same statue. See, this statue, unlike me, is able to dance because they're on. And so what we remember is that there are moments of connection. There are moments when you feel that something's being co-created. They're not all the moments. A lot of the moments that are left out are moments when you're trying to get back to it, when you're sort of thinking about things. But if there are moments of that co-creation, that's where we meet ourselves. That's where we do another stitch in our own development. And that's where we do the stitches together with adolescents who are having trouble sewing. Thank you very much.